So let's carry on with Chapter 11, Guerrilla War. This is the second video in Walzer's book, Part 3, The War Convention. So I left off in the last video talking about this notion of transfer of sort of these civilian rights over to a guerrilla organization. Well, again, just the whole idea is if civilians lacked rights, it wouldn't be of any use to try and hide amongst civilians. So the AG forces, the anti-guerrilla forces, have this belief that civilians have rights, they're maintaining, they're respecting the combatant, non-combatant distinction, and they should. There's advantages to doing this, even if the guerrillas try to blur it, right? So the AG has scruples, and it's pragmatically advantageous for the AG for the anti-guerrilla forces to maintain those scruples, namely a recognition of the combatant, non-combatant distinction, no matter what. Okay, so that's why this recognition of it is stressed as a fundamental principle, and in the so-called handbooks, like the manuals of handling insurgencies. The anti-insurgents handbook, the anti-guerrilla handbook, has this isolate and separate policy, right? That this fundamental principle of, okay, the distinction is there, and our job is to make it more explicit because the guerrillas are trying to blur it. So we, as an anti-guerrilla strategy, are trying to block them from blurring it and make it more obvious. So certain rules of engagement are, Walzer talks about them in the American context of the invasion of Vietnam, or their police effort, whatever you want to call it. In Vietnam, basically, they were in there having a rules of engagement where they're trying to isolate and separate the civilians from the guerrillas by, warning villages, like, if you're a civilian, get out because we're going to bomb the place. And a variety of kinds of rules of engagement. We're always trying to keep this, right? But that only makes sense, right? This idea of splitting guerrillas from the population, right? The battle for the hearts and minds, right? Because you're really trying to get the civilians on your side so they don't back the guerrillas. But that's only going to work. That's only going to make some sense if the presupposition of it in the first place, namely that there's some daylight between the guerrillas and the population, is actually existent. That is, that the guerrillas aren't exactly completely in line with the population, and vice versa, that there is no daylight, right? That really, in the end, it's kind of like, as they used to say, a levée en masse, right? A general uprising. That's really what it is. So what if this is actually impossible? And that is that there is no daylight between the guerrillas and the population. Well, you have a limiting case of anti-guerrilla tactics and strategy, right? Because basically there isn't really anything you can do about it. Because in that sense, if this is an impossible thing to even do, because there is no daylight in the first place between the guerrillas and the population, and you keep fighting, what you're doing as an anti-guerrilla or an counterinsurgency, it's not really counterinsurgency anymore. It's basically what Walzer says is an anti-social war. It's basically a war against the people, right? You're just sending your forces in. You might talk about anti-guerrilla or anti-counterinsurgency and all that, but you're just fighting the population. That's what you're doing. It's not really a war in the sense of you're fighting another specific state. You're just fighting a population. So in other words, let's try and sort of summarize, and following Walzer's discussion is that there's kind of a continuum here we can think about. So the base of the continuum is the concept of support and difficulty. If we look at on the far left of the diagram here, there's no popular support, increasing popular support until you get complete idealized popular support, which no group really ever has, but you can get closer to it. Now, from the side of the anti-guerrilla or the counterinsurgency, when a guerrilla group G1 is here with no popular support, Walzer says history shows that you can defeat these. And it's not extraordinarily difficult to defeat groups that really have very little to no popular support. So it's not too difficult to win, for the AG to win. in that case. And that's why guerrilla groups, actively try to encourage their popular support, because they know if they don't have it, they're not going to be treated as really as having any war rights. They're just going to be treated as just complete criminals, and they won't even be treated as soldiers or whatnot. They would just be treated as bandits and criminals if they lack all popular support. So there's no representational dimension to the guerrilla group G1. But as they gain more popular support, there is this kind of quote unquote transference of the war rights of the people to be treated in certain ways that now are transferring to the guerrillas. So they'd be more respected as kinds of soldiers or whatnot, so they're not just completely treated as bandits. They would be treated as soldiers, prisoners of war, etc., etc. So they're getting increasing support. But of course, this is going to now coincide with an increasing difficulty for the AG forces. It's harder and harder. The more and more popular the guerrilla group gets, the more difficult. So basically, the daylight is here. It's the full daylight, right? Night and day kind of thing. Here it's starting to pinch off. And this policy, of course, which presupposes daylight between the two groups, is going to get ever more difficult, right? So the increasing difficulty for the AG forces. Now, until you hit this kind of zone where you're getting to the level of like overwhelming popular support, that is, the population is really on board. The daylight is pinching off. The support for the guerrillas is going up. And so if a group gets into this zone, right, and I've just got it sort of kind of this blurry little zone, which the AG forces are desperately trying to prevent any guerrilla group from getting into this zone, because that's when it turns essentially into a people's war, kind of the levée en masse. Now you're fighting the population because there's not much daylight anymore. You're approaching this limiting case of the complete support where it's turning into it simply a war against the people, and you're losing this battle of, you've pretty well lost it when you get to this point. So the AG project, the whole strategic project of fighting the war essentially collapses, and because you have a people's war. And it becomes pretty well, not only is it sort of this moral transgression to even continue it, it becomes virtually impossible to win. Because basically you're in the position where the only way you can win it is just destroy the populations. And so, kind of from a Kantian perspective, like the notion of victory is kind of very difficult to even make sense of. Well, we won the war against them, we just destroyed everything. So it's not really even a clear notion of victory. It's just basically, it's just simply fighting by destruction, which ties into this distinction between jus ad bellum and jus in bello, which Walzer said, hey, isn't that a complete logical distinction? Well, as critics, go after him for saying that, and as I said back in a video earlier, when he made that distinction, probably shouldn't have said logical distinction. It's more of a pragmatic distinction, because he admits right here it collapses, right? There's no real, once the G3, once the G appears as a G3 in this, shall we say, this zone of overwhelming public support, then there's really no, there's the other side, the anti-guerrilla forces, they don't have a just cause anymore. They can't fight. There's no such thing as fighting this ethically anymore from the AG perspective. It's bang, it's gone, right? You can't fight it, and you shouldn't fight it, you can't fight it. It's all collapsed. The whole project collapses. So jus ad bellum and jus ad bello kind of come together, and they both collapse. There's and so Walzer says, look, if the anti-guerrilla forces or the counterinsurgency forces are, let's say, other states, products of other states coming in to try and quash a guerrilla revolution or insurgency, if they're foreigners, this now has just become a people's war, or it's become just a war of aggression, right? The foreigners now that are trying to control the guerrillas are just now, this is a war of aggression. It's flipped, right? It's no longer any kind of counterinsurgency. This is just a group, an external body, a state, trying to control another one, and that's just simply aggression. If it's the government, so even if this down here, if the AGs are the government and they get an insurrection on their hands and they're fighting, well, once this hits a certain kind of representative level, then basically it's just a government tyranny. This is just a dictatorship. And it's right to fight this collapses as well. So there, underneath all this is the morality is contingent, of course, upon what the people want. The people are sovereign. They may want terrible things, who knows? But in the sense that if the guerrillas get this into this zone of overwhelming public support, the ethics and everything just changes. So that's why that's why everybody talks so much, both on the guerrilla and the anti-guerrilla side, the insurgents and the counterinsurgents. How everybody is talking about winning the hearts and minds of the people, because when it's in this zone, it tends to favor one side, because usually the AG forces probably have a bit more money and all that, which is why the reaction to them takes the form of guerrilla warfare, relying on deception and conceit and all that. And not just, pitched battles at dawn with regular standing armies. But once you get, and that's why these guys on the G side are trying to get it over to here, because it makes it more difficult, both practically to win, and becomes more increasingly morally untenable for the AG to keep fighting. And that's why the AG side is trying to block it, to keep it over here, because they want to keep the difficulty level down and their morality level up. And that's why the key concept really in all of this in guerrilla warfare is this: the battle for the hearts and mind. The battles for the empires of the mind, as writers have often said, that's key when there's such a big asymmetry in the strength of the forces that are competing for control. And one side's trying to get their group in here, and the other side is desperately trying to keep them out. All right, so here's an example of where Walzer admits that this really isn't completely, in his mind, a logical distinction. It's more of a pragmatic one. So that's always good to keep in mind if you go back and read those earlier chapters when he invokes it and calls it a logical distinction. Okay, so that wraps up guerrilla war. We'll look at terrorism next. See you next video.